Good morning, everybody. Welcome in our third session of the RETHINK final seminar. My name is Isabelle Diependaele and I work for Kazerne Dossin. Yesterday we had a very interesting intervention by Wouter Sinave from In Flanders Field Museum, where he showed us how his museum brings remembrance education to the classroom and uses the touchstone of remembrance education. And today we offer you again a nice program with 3 speakers in a panel. And I would like to give the floor to EuroClio. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabelle. Hello, everyone. Before getting started with the panel, I just wanted to say a few words about who we are at EuroClio and what was our role in the project. And then I will give the floor to my colleague, Catherine, who will be introducing the speakers. My name is Alicia Modena. I am Deputy Director and Professional Development Coordinator at EuroClio. And within the project RETHINK, we have been involved in the upscaling of the practices, which I have mentioned yesterday, and in the development of a teacher's guide on remembrance education. And I am very, very happy and interested in what will happen with the panel, because this panel will discuss remembrance education in practices, bringing voices from different fields. And throughout the project, we have been discussing a lot what does it mean to put different fields in contact and to learn lessons about remembrance education from one field and transfer it to the other. And I believe that this panel will be particularly helpful to shed some light on this. So without further ado, Catherine, if you want to take it away.
Sure, and thank you, Alicia, for introducing the panel. Like Alicia said, today what we're going to be speaking about is remembrance education in practice, voices from different fields. How is it that we take this rather theoretical idea of remembrance education and from different angles bring it into practice, into the classroom and in society in general? So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Professor Dariusz Stola is a historian of 20th century Polish political and social history, Polish and Jewish relations and the Holocaust, international migrations, and the communist regime. He is currently a historian and professor at the Institute of Political Studies at the Polish Academy of Science, and was the former director of the Poland Museum of the History of Polish Jews. Just a fun fact, in the late 1980s, he was a journalist and editor of The Independent, so then illegal biweekly Wola and Refleksy, a student bulletin. His work, A Country with No Exit, Migrations from Poland, 1949 to 1989, was awarded the History Book of the Year by Polityka News magazine and shortlisted for 3 other major book awards. And his work has been recognized many times, from the Jewish Veterans Association of Poland for the contribution to commemorations of the uprisings and the history of Polish Jews, to the University of Warsaw for a contribution to migration studies. So here to speak with us today about how can we present a difficult past in a way that is meaningful today, Mr. Dariusz Stola. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Can you see my presentation? I hope so. So this picture shows broadly what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to combine my experience as a research scholar, as an academic historian, and as a museum director. And on this picture, you can see my city, Warsaw, a beautiful skyline of a modern city. But the first thing you see is this new modern building of the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews. Another object I would like you to see is left to it is the monument of the Warsaw Ghetto. And I'll also please note that all the buildings that you see are new buildings. There are no historical buildings within more than a kilometer. Everything was destroyed during the war. So it's a post-apocalyptic landscape, which shows a difficult history. I would like to offer you some reflections on challenges facing those who educate about difficult past, that means the events or phenomena of the past that are difficult to accept by some people, because the memories of these events remain painful or controversial or shameful or just difficult to comprehend. My country was unfortunate in the 20th century to be the place of mass death, suffering, and destruction. Together with other countries of Eastern Europe, between the Baltic and the Black Seas, between Berlin and Moscow, Poland made part of what Timothy Snyder called the Bloodlands, the lands where some 14 million non-combatant civilians were deliberately killed in policies of extermination in a relatively short period, just several years between 1930s and 1945. And a major part of this death toll were Holocaust victims, people whom the Nazis and their collaborators condemned to death because they just had Jewish grandparents. That was the definition of being a Jew under German occupation. So just being born in a Jewish family made you a target of a genocidal project. So Poland was the home of the largest Jewish community in pre-war Europe, some 3.4 million people. Today, many years later, is the country of a tiny minority of only several thousand Jews among almost 40 million people. So for Polish Jews, and also for Jews visiting Poland from Israel, United States, or other countries, thinking about Jewish past in Poland is just painful. The first thing that comes to their minds is death, suffering, and destruction. It's similar with many other people, non-Jews, for whom history of Poland is associated closely with the Holocaust, with the pictures of the Auschwitz death camp and other camps. So it's painful. Moreover, for non-Jewish Poles, the story has an additional complexity because Second World War was the time of massive destruction, not only of the Jewish community, but also some 3 million non-Jewish Poles who were killed. The city of Warsaw was almost completely destroyed. But in addition to this, Poland has a history of quite widespread and virulent anti-Semitism, of prejudice, discrimination, and violence. And also under the German occupation during the Second World War, there were some Poles who extended help to the Jews, risking their life because that was punishable by death. But there were other Poles who either collaborated with the occupier or exploited the Jewish defenselessness for private profit, while others remained passive, and actually we are not quite sure what they thought about. Did they fail to help, or did they disobey the orders of the occupier to assist in hunting the Jews? So this is a quite complex topic which keeps rising emotions, keeps rising highly emotional debates. And we have seen such debates across Europe in many countries. Actually, I know only 2 countries with no such debates in the last 30 years. But in Poland, this debate seems especially intensive and emotional because it was a place of so much killing and suffering of Jews during the war. So what I would like to bring to you from my experience at the museum and as a historian who took part in these debates is the following. Namely, the message which I was trying to convey to my fellow citizens throughout these years is that we are not responsible for what some members of our nation or other group we can identify with did or failed to do 70 or 80 years ago, well before we were born. But we are responsible for what we do with this past today. This is our responsibility, because we can do something about this past, or we can fail to do something about this past, leave it to others. So this is the broadest message I try to convey. But let me now give you an example of how does it work with the Polin Museum. So first, the monument of the Warsaw Ghetto. Let me see if you... Do you see it?
No, we are still seeing the main page.
Huh. Just a second. Okay, I probably have to suspend it for a while and start it again. Just a second. Okay, here I am. Okay, sorry for this delay and technical problems. So what you see here is the monument of the Warsaw Ghetto, standing actually among the ruins. In the middle of ruins, you see buildings almost completely destroyed or completely destroyed within more than a kilometer. And the monument was erected in 1948. The museum stands now in front of it. What I would like to stress about this monument is that the monument is not the past it refers to. We have seen last year highly emotional controversies about various monuments around the world, especially the monuments that relate to the history of colonialism and racism in United States and Europe. And some of these monuments fell down. So there is certain sensitivity about the monuments now. And this monument is also a monument not only of the Warsaw Ghetto, but also a monument of the moment when it was erected. So here you see in front of it, these are the figures of the fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943. You can see armed people, mostly young, with hand grenades and guns fighting. And it shows certain tendency of the 1940s because the back of the monument, this is the back of the monument, shows civilians being marched by German soldiers to the railway station, to the deportation place from where they were deported to the death camps, to the gas chambers. So in a way, the monument prioritized the active fighting men over the civilians, as if the civilians were less important than the fighters. Moreover, this monument, it follows a great European tradition dating back to antiquity of presenting the heroes, the fighting men. You can immediately see the affinity to the classic European sculpture, but it's very much against the Jewish religious tradition, which forbids representing human figures. So this monument of the Jewish ghetto is very un-Jewish monument. It shows the controversies between the people who are in the monument committee, mostly left-wing, very progressive people who are critical of religion. And this is how they made the most important, the best-known monument of the Holocaust in Poland and probably in Europe in a very non-Jewish tradition. So already at that time there were controversies. What are the proper ways of important for me is that the Polin Museum, here you see the relation between the monument and the museum. Polin Museum is not a Holocaust museum. It makes part of the Holocaust Memorial Complex. In addition to the monument I have shown you, there are a dozen of smaller commemorative objects like this black dark cube you can see here in the picture. They commemorate various figures and organizations from the war period. So the museum makes part of the memorial complex, but it's not a Holocaust museum. Contrary to the best-known Holocaust memorial museums like the Yad Vashem in Jerusalem or the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. in the United States, Polin Museum is a museum of all the history of Polish Jews. You see, its architecture is not like an architecture of a museum of a dramatic moment in the past. And it also shows that in addition to the dramatic years of the German occupation and the Holocaust, the place where the museum stands is the place of a very rich and long history of the Jewish community in Poland. So its architecture, here you can see the main lobby. If you have seen the Yad Vashem in Jerusalem or the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., or any other Holocaust museum, you immediately see the difference between the architectures. Actually, this architecture is open for interpretation. Many people were asking me, what is the meaning of this lobby? Strange shape. And there is no canonical interpretation of it. But I was very happy that people wanted to know the meaning. They were looking for a meaning in it. So the museum shows all the history of Polish Jews, including the glorious ages when Poland was home of most of all the Jews in the world, which means proportionally more than is Israel today. You can see a beautiful synagogue from the 18th century. The Holocaust Gallery is the biggest one of the galleries at the museum, but it's not the last gallery. Is the largest one, and it mostly depicts the history of the Warsaw Ghetto, because the museum stands in the middle of what was Warsaw Ghetto. But even showing this most dramatic years of Polish Jewish history, it's trying to be a museum of life. It shows how the Jews, the prisoners of the ghetto, were struggling for survival. Their innovative spirit, incredible resilience, efforts. Most of these efforts failed because only a tiny minority of Polish Jews survived the war. But still showing this history, we mostly show attempts for survival. We show the massive destruction. For example, here you can see a long list of the ghettos and various stages of the Nazi anti-Jewish policy. But the historians and curators who are making this gallery in a very sensible way were trying also to restore the agency to the victims of the Holocaust, not to show them as just passive victims of someone else killing. Restoring agency was a crucial effort of the makers of this gallery. Moreover, the Holocaust Gallery is not the last one. The museum has a post-war gallery showing Jewish life in communist Poland and then in democratic Poland since 1989. And the last exhibit in the core exhibition is a big touchscreen with interviews with the leaders of the Jewish community of Warsaw today, which conveys a message that the history this museum shows has not ended. It didn't end in 1945. It continues in a different form. And in this sense, this museum will never be completed, hopefully, because in 5 or 10 years from now, the curators will have to add something about the present, about what is present today and will be history in a few years from now. Let me show you this picture. You see the crowds of people coming between the opening in 2014 to the beginning of the lockdown. The museum attracted 3.5 million visits and became one of the most successful museums in Europe. Actually, we've got several European Museum Awards. Crowds of people were coming. We could watch their emotions expressed. We could listen to their questions and their comments. We were gathering these questions and comments to learn how does it work. Is the exhibition effective in conveying the messages we wanted to convey? And we learned some interesting lessons about it, such as that For example, people appreciated very much that we are not trying to impose a canonical narrative, that we are offering various perspectives on the same events, that people can see the same event from various perspectives, that historians can offer different interpretations, not clashing interpretations, but showing different aspects of the facts, and also that sometimes historians disagree, that sometimes we are not sure what happened, how things happened, or how to judge them. And actually, a major effort of the exhibition was to encourage reflection by the visitors. And I will give you one example. One of the most dramatic moments of the post-war history is in summer of 1946, when there was a pogrom in the town of Kielce in central Poland with some 42 people killed. And it's, highly disgraceful moment and highly controversial. We had long debates in Poland about it, who was responsible, who is to blame for it. And in this moment, the museum shows just several documents, how it was presented by the Communist Party, how it was presented by the anti-communist opposition, how it was presented by independent intellectuals. And we were leaving the visitors with a challenge to develop their own conclusion out of the sources. So inviting the visitors into a discussion, into a reflection, was our way of presenting a difficult past. But let me point at something which is between the monument and the museum, and this is the square, this space. I still remember when I was young, it was big, windy, cold square. I remember commemorations of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, which is April 19. Usually it was very cold, it was before the global warming started to show itself. Now you have this beautiful modern architecture by a Finnish architect, and the square in between for me is important because this is a symbol of the space between education and commemoration. Museum is primarily an educational institution. This is how we see it. The core exhibition for us is an instrument of education. The monument is an instrument of commemoration. It's to make people remember. As you have seen, it's dramatic, it's to raise emotions. At the museum, we were not trying to raise emotions. One of the principles, curatorial principles, was that the more dramatic is an event, is a story, the less emotional should be the ways of conveying it. There is much emotion in the story. We don't have to inflate them. We don't have to inflame them additionally, because it may hinder the education. And the square between the monument and the museum, for me, is the metaphor of the space for discussion. This is a space for public ceremonies. For the anniversaries, you have official delegations coming with flowers and candles and so on. We also have made concerts there to show that you can commemorate the victims of the Warsaw Ghetto with art, and that art is very important in both education and commemoration. But also, it's a space between a past and the future, and you can see it. This is a very modern architecture, and a monument which is a sign of the time of the 1940s, and it refers to a moment in the 1940s. But it's very much about the present. The present is in between the past and the future. This is between the commemoration and learning. And for me, as I said, it symbolizes the place for discussion, the place where we meet and talk, where we express different opinions, and where we try to reach a shared conclusion. Because it's never clear what nations actually have. In most cases, they have a shared past, and the discussion about what is the shared past is very much important for contemporary identities, which shape the past to the future. So in Poland, as I have said, such discussions were quite dramatic, and for me, they were also great, because discussions were a form of commemoration, of bringing the past to the fore, to the attention of contemporary generations. It was a kind of a living monument. I believe that more people learned new things about the Holocaust and the Polish Jewish history during these debates when media massively covered these debates. when journalists were calling me 3 times a day to show up in the studio because they had a discussion on something. So I think that was a great opportunity for education, and also for soul searching, for a moral thinking about the past and the present, who we are, what do we want to keep from the past, how do we judge the past of our ancestors. So what is important, I believe, a conclusion from these debates, is that the first things that we owe to the victims is truth. This is our duty to be truthful. If you feel a moral obligations to the victims of horrible crimes of the past, our first duty is to be truthful. And the truth is also the best basis for any education. I have spent 25 years of my life, all my formal education in schools at the university in Communist Poland, when the government massively distorted and manipulated the past, and it failed. The communist government in Poland lost the war about the past before it lost control of the government in 1989. And that was one of the reasons why the communist dictatorship failed, because its citizens knew that it was lying about the past. So the truth is the most solid and the best basis for education, also the best basis to react against distortion and denial. So this is my second important message. What does it mean? It means supporting research, it means fighting against distortion and denial, and it means teaching the skills of learning, how to distinguish between falsehood, what is true, what is false, what is reliable and what is not. Today, it's very much about the skills of critical reading of new media, critical reading of both text and images, of the visual content, which is, as you certainly know, more powerful, much more effective than the text may be. So research and learning the skills of the critical reading of new media, I believe, to be the crucial mission of institutions like the Polin Museum. Also, it's about helping the students, the public, the people we meet as employees or activists in institutions like the museum, help developing the will and the habit to recognize between what is true and what is false. The courage and the inclination to defend what is true and oppose lies, and avoid them, even if lies make us feel good. Because the biggest challenge today to Holocaust education, in my understanding, is not so much Holocaust denial, but Holocaust distortion, at least in Eastern Europe. There are massive efforts, including the governments, including my own government, the government of Poland, to distort the past, to show a rosy picture of the past, to claim that almost all the Poles were courageous helpers, and only a tiny minority did collaborate. And this is not true. The proportions were different. That was the drama of these horrible moments, that people were facing a dilemmas, and not all of them were heroes. So the skill, the ability to confront it, but also the willingness and the habit to confront it, even if the distorted representation makes you feel good, when it may be uplifting. And also, it's to show a possible joy of standing up for truth and justice, and the desire to stand up for truth and justice against the denial and distortion. And then what is needed is to offer a better story, a story which is well-founded and verified, because only a narrative can replace a narrative. When we are facing a massive flow of fake news, of conspiracy theories, including those related to the Holocaust and other dramatic past that we have in European countries, we cannot be only reactive. Learning the critical skills is important, but then it's important to offer better stories, that are equally attractive, but truthful. And not being reactive also means not restricting our efforts to responding to lies. We should take initiative, which means to set the agenda, choose the topics, choose the time and place of the battle with the distorters and deniers, not to leave the initiative to them. And I have seen it again and again in the museum work, that this is possible and this is effective. That means we were deciding, for example, what anniversary we would like to highlight in a given year, how we would like to present it, what aspects of the past, because the past is infinitely rich. We always make a decision what aspects of it we present, what fragment of it we present. And we were not trying to be just an agency to react to some anti-Semitic statement or some distortion, because that would leave initiative in the hands of distorters and deniers. We were taking initiative, and that was much more effective from the educational point of view. So now going back to this picture of Warsaw, it's a very dynamic city, it's a fast-growing city, it's a city of fast-growing immigration. For the first time in the history of Poland since the Middle Ages, we have massive inflow of immigrants, mostly from neighboring Ukraine. You know, in just a few years, we've got 1 million people more in Poland. The Poles are immigrating to other countries, but also we have seen mass inflow of immigrants, and it means new challenges for a society which, between the Second World War and until recently, was very homogeneous. There were few people of different skin color, of different language, of different culture, and this is a major challenge for a society to develop a way of living in a diverse society. At present, we have a government which is quite xenophobic and rather hinder these efforts. But the efforts of the museum, which were about bringing Jewish history to the light again, including the Holocaust history to the light again, they were not only about the past, they were very much about the future my country wants to choose. Thank you very much for your attention. If you would like to learn more about the museum, you can visit the website. We run several websites. We have a total annual audience of more than 1.5 million people visiting them. So supposedly there is something interesting about it. And you can easily find also publications and websites that deal about the Polish debates on the Holocaust, that were many and that were very interesting, exactly as moments of controversy, of conflicting opinions about the past, and the positive outcomes. Not all of the outcomes of these debates were positive and welcome. There was some, nasty things being done, but in the general, the discussion for me was the best way of commemorating and developing a shared understanding of difficult past. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Stola, for such a thought-provoking and rich presentation. I've always found it incredible how professors are able to stuff so much information into such a small period of time. I definitely wish I had the same ability. And you definitely raised some very important issues that are going to be common threads throughout the three presentations that we're going to be listening to today, particularly the next one by Martin von Allstein, who also is going to be touching on the topic of debate and controversy, and how do we find this space for discussion with very controversial and very sensitive and often very painful topics, particularly with history and remembrance. So this leads me straight to our next speaker, Martin van Allstein. He is a senior researcher at the Flemish Peace Institute in Brussels, where his work focuses on conflict transformation, peace education, and history education. With a background in history, international politics, and law, Martin has looked at the intersection between these fields, at radicalization and polarization in society, at controversy and tensions in a classroom setting, and more broadly, how conflict, either on a micro or on a macro scale, can be addressed and overcome. So he has also worked on issues of illicit firearm trade and ownership, security politics in the digital age, and the intersection, of course, between history and memory. and here to speak with us today about the theories of remembrance education and how to bring them into practice. How can we learn from a violent past and address it in the diverse classrooms of today? So without further ado, thank you very much for being with us today. You're muted.
Okay, that's solved now. Thank you very much for the introduction, for the invitation to speak at this very interesting conference. So maybe first let me check if the PowerPoint is working. So is it on screen now? On my screen, it's still shared, so maybe Alicia can bring it up. Okay, so everything is okay now. Okay, great. So let me start with the guiding question that I want to address today, and that is, how can super diverse groups of students learn from difficult history and memories of war and violence for peace? So there is a normative dimension here. I'm sorry, I'm still not sure whether everyone can see the slide. Could someone in the chat please confirm that it's okay? Okay, so it's up now. I'm sorry for that technical issue. Is it switching the slides? I can see my. Okay, but I already went to the next slide. So okay, here we are. So this is the guiding question. How can super diverse groups of students learn from difficult pasts? Next slide, please. And the important thing maybe here to highlight is that I bring this insight from the Flemish context, and that needs two clarifications. The first of all is the Flemish context, which means the Belgian context. But in the Belgian state structure, the communities are responsible for education. So I speak from that part of the country, the Dutch-speaking Flemish part of the country, and I bring these insights from, as it was mentioned in the main question, a super diverse context. The classrooms and schools in cities like Brussels and Antwerp, where we want to bring, as educational professionals, the violent past and memories of that violent past into the present for these young people from a very diverse background. Next slide, please. So my suggestion would be to raise or to share three reflections, and these are on pedagogical opportunities and pitfalls. So there, my talk will be mainly from a pedagogical point of view, and I would like to raise three questions in particular. And my suggestion would be that, as the target audience, I would like to speak to educational professionals, teachers, people in museums working in remembrance education. My suggestion would be to think about three questions or issues in particular. The first is the relation between history and memory. The second one is the various forms of memory, and then their implications for remembrance education in practice. And the third is, we should always think about like the objectives. What do we want to achieve with a particular or concrete project? Okay, next slide, please. First of all, this issue of the difference between history and memory, or importantly, between history education and remembrance education. So it's an important one because when remembrance education, which is actually memory education in the Flemish context, was first established in 10, 12 years ago, there was some criticism on the part of not only history teachers, but also professional historians. And the question was raised, what is exactly the relationship between these two, between history education and remembrance education? And before we start with doing remembrance education, I think we should be clear, or should be thinking and reflecting on that issue. Now, history education, there's a lot of ways to define it. It has elements there of it's more an academic discipline where historical thinking is important, multi-perspectivity, the many narratives or interpretations that are possible on one and the same phenomenon in the past. Also source criticisms, reading sources critically. So it is more of an academic with some distance between the observer and what has happened in the past. Remembrance education, on the other hand, is something else. So next slide, please. My idea would be that we should always think about how to unpack the relations between these two, between history and memory education. Now, first point here to make is that one of the criticism on the part of historians in Flemish context was that history, remembrance education or memory education runs the risk of being too moralizing, which in their view runs the risk of being too instrumentalizing towards the past. Now, this is something we should take into consideration because it's an important point of criticism, I think. On the other hand, and this is where always the ambivalence manifests itself, in memory or remembrance education, the idea is to learn something from the past for the present, to do something with this past. And this is what I think Professor Stola was talking about so beautifully, that we are responsible today for how we address and deal with the painful episodes of violent histories in the past. And then, instead of being moralizing, I think one of the points of remembrance education is that it speaks to this point that violent pasts and violent histories speak to our conscience. They engage us morally, and that is something we should work out with young people as well. How to work with this moral engagement that this violent past speaks to us. In another sense, we could also conceive of it in terms of moral judgments, and not in the easy sense of talking about heroes and villains, but somehow this past is painful, violent, it speaks to our conscience, and it engages us to somehow come to moral judgments. And how do we do this with young people? There are links here with moral philosophy, I think, which are very interesting to explore. But this is the ambivalence I want to point out here. That in remembrance education, unlike maybe in history education, we have to work with this moral dimension of the violent past, how it speaks to us. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. And then maybe it is interesting to think about remembrance education in two ways. On the one hand, it can be education through memory. It's like remembering, not forgetting, lest we forget. No, never again, as Nina was talking about in our keynote speech 2 days ago. This is important, but at the same time, and here critical historians raise another point as well, of course, the memories and history can also be, like, it can be used, instrumentalized, maybe even abused. And this raises the question, how should we remember in schools or with young people from a political point of view? So this is something we should take into account as well. And that's why I make the distinction between education through memory, but remembrance education should also, I think, in my view, should be education about memory. What exactly is memory? What are the politics of memory? How are memories presented? What are the different narratives? What are the political dimensions? And this is something we can and should, I think, take up with young people as well. Next slide, please. But here, I think it's important to think about what I call the psycho-geographical dimensions of remembrance education. And I speak here from the Flemish context. You see two pictures. One is the Menengate in Ypres. The other one is Kazerne Dossin, the Holocaust Museum in Mechelen in Belgium, in Flanders. And what I mean by this psycho-geographical dimension linked to the distinction between education through memory and education about memory is that we should be aware as educational professionals or as teachers going with classrooms to these sites. what you can do, or the critical perspective you can take in a classroom might be different than when you go on site. For instance, the Menin Gate is clearly a political building. At the same time, it's a site of mourning, of integrity, serenity. And the point I'm trying to make here is that teachers and educational professionals should be aware of this ambivalence of these buildings. For instance, you can take young people to a last post ceremony under the Menin Gate, and then go through this ceremony at the same time, or in another, in the classroom or on another side, you can talk about what this building means politically. I mean, for instance, the imperial iconography and architecture, characterizing it. The second picture is of the Kazerne Dossin. I want to point out here is an interesting that on the left-hand side you just see the facade of the old barracks. It was a military building where people from the Jewish communities in Antwerp and Brussels were brought together to be deported to the east. And in that building there is now a memorial. The museum itself is in the large white building, and it's interesting that the designers made this distinction between like a memorial, which is a site of mourning and reflection, and a museum, which is another kind of place where you can take a more where you can do other things from a pedagogical point of view. Okay, so that's the first point. Next slide, please. The second point I want to raise is that I think it might be useful for all of us in this educational field to think about the various forms of memory and then specifically their implications for remembrance education. Let me try to make that clear. I want to make two distinctions in terms of what kind of forms of memory we can conceptualize. The first is the distinction of Jan Assmann, and he talks about three or four kinds of memory, and I will try to illustrate it with the history of the First World War. So next slide, please. First, you have individual memory, which is like the memory of the people who went through it. For instance, German soldier in the First World War. Communicative memory, next slide, please, is where this memory somehow is communicated, maybe in a community of veterans, like when they built and opened the Menin Gate, there were a number of war veterans there. They shared these memories, but also, for instance, fathers and grandfathers talking, or grandmothers, or people going through this history, talking about their memories and the history to their children and grandchildren. That is what you can call communicative memory, 1 or 2 generations. After that, Jan Assmann says, these kinds of memories tend to become cultural memories. For instance, the Menin Gate. It is a building now in Ypres. Most war veterans have passed away, but people now visit it, and it has become something in the landscape. It is a cultural memory with all kinds of meanings and narratives surrounding it, but it's become cultural memory. At the same time, it's a kind of political memory, because it has political iconography and meanings attached to it. Now, the second kind of distinction we can make is between, next slide, please, goes more to the substance of these memories. And there's a distinction Jenny Atkins makes between linear memory and traumatic memory. Linear memory is the memory or the kind of history most historians are used to. It's like past, present, future. What has happened is in the past. Now we are in the present and we think about that past, but it is kind of closed off to us. Traumatic memory works in a different kind of philosophical way. Next slide, please. Traumatic memory has the tendency to come back. The past is not the past. The past at any point can brutally enter the present again. It's not past. For people who are confronted with traumatic memories, these memories tend to come back, and they are really lived or even relived in the present as present. And I don't know if the picture shows itself very clear. It's a famous painting by Will Longstaff, and it's the Menin Gate again in the 1920s. And rising up from the fields are like the ghosts, the specters of the soldiers who died. So that's why traumatic memory sometimes is also being referred to as spectral memory. It's a violent past that keeps haunting the present. It's difficult to let go. Now, these are various forms of memory we can distinguish. What is my point now in remembrance education? That these kinds, if you bring these kinds of memories or histories to super diverse classrooms today, these various forms of memory have implications for how you can bring remembrance education into classrooms. And I will try to make that clear by drawing three sequences. The next slide, please. And the first one is, again, based on the history of the First World War. You can go with a classroom to Ypres, maybe, yeah. And you see the first picture. This is Ypres in 1919, completely destroyed. And if you show that picture to a number of young people today, for them it's really history. 100 years ago is quite distant. But in that same, if you go to these sites with a super diverse group and you show these kinds of pictures, for some of the pupils in the classroom, these might be cues for what they see on television screens or what they lived through themselves before, for instance, if they migrated from the Middle East after 2015. Now, this is a sequence where past and present tend to move together or blend somehow and on the one hand, and this is again a story of ambivalence, on the one hand, this offers pedagogical opportunities. You can talk with pupils about these links between past and present, how that works. You can draw comparisons. You could try to engage them in thinking about the links between past and present. At the same time, I think as educational professionals, we should be aware that a picture that you show that for you as a teacher might be a distant past. For some people, might trigger images that are not so past. So the message, the underlying message here is one of, I think, thinking well in advance what kind of group you work with. And the second sequence I want to show is, next slide, please. This is a picture of Verbrennung in between Antwerp and Brussels. This was the spot where a lot of political prisoners in the Second World War were taken to by the Nazis and their collaborators, and they were tortured there. This is really a gruesome place where most pupils who go there are really confronted with a very harsh reality. But you might be, as an educational professional, the next slide, please, might be aware that stories of torture in the Belgian context here are like 75 years ago, but for others, and I show here a picture of a site of torture in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Prijedor. For other pupils, it might be very close by. It might be stories they heard from their fathers. And this is a story I heard from a teacher in Antwerp, where she tried to teach some histories of the Second World War, but there were a number of young people from a Bosnian Herzegovinian background in our classroom. And she was confronted by this, and for her it was not easy. After that experience, what she did, and this might be a good way of going around that, at the end of the first year, she teaches history. At the beginning of the year, she always talks to all our students in the classroom. She let them fill out some kind of a questionnaire, and she asks about their background, about what kind of history they know of, and what might be sensitive, so she can really engage and be aware of the possible pitfalls. Again, there are pedagogical opportunities here, but there are also things we should be careful about. In terms of these various forms of memory, for some people, this is distant cultural memory. For other young people, this might raise links that are very close by, that might be either individual traumatic memory or communicative traumatic memory. And the next slide, please, the last sequence I want to show this is I already showed the picture at the beginning of the presentation. This is a statue of a Belgian colonial military man who was in Belgian Congo at the end of the 19th century, Baron Danis. And this was part of a bigger structure, a statue in Antwerp from the 1920s to the 1950s, but then it got broken down, and one of the remnants of this larger structure ended up in one of the museums, the Park Museum of Fine Arts in Antwerp. It stands there on the margins of the park, actually, and for a number of people, this might be like cultural memory, it's distant past. And then again, next slide, of course, over the last 2 or 3 years, these colonial statues, colonial heritage has become very active again. And a number of people, most notably the Black Lives Matter movement, have turned their activism towards these kind of statues. This might also be happening in the classroom, and again, pedagogical pitfalls, pedagogical opportunities, a lot here, but also be aware that history, for some people in the classroom, might be distant cultural memory. For other pupils, it might be very close by and even very sensitive to painful. Okay, this is the second point I wanted to make, and then the last point is about, next slide please, is about this idea, what can we do to learn from the violent and to bring it into the present and learn something from violent histories for, let's say, from my point of view of peace education for peace. And then here the idea is never again. This is a deeply felt sentiment by a lot of war veterans after the war, but how, and it's still alive. We see a picture of Nooit meer oorlog, which means never war again, no more war, with the broken rifle. How can you bring that into practice? This is one of the main issues, of course, of remembrance education, if you compare it with history education. It has this moral engagement to it. Okay, next slide. It's actually the last one as well. So how do we actually learn? How can we, with young people, learn from that difficult past, from the violent past? In the RETHINK project, based on what was developed in the Flemish context, and this is the book the Flemish Special Committee wrote about this, Vroeger gaat niet over, which actually means the past does not really end, which of course refers to this kind of cyclical traumatic vein of memory. In the RETHINK project, they make a distinction between these three steps: knowledge and insight. This is more the historical thinking, the academic point of view, really important, the first base, the first step you have to take in good projects. Then the idea is to involve the audience in historical empathy, involvement, participation, that they feel they are engaged. And then the third step is what I want to talk about now, is the part of reflection and action. And this is really where the ambition lies. Like, we should do something with this difficult past in the present. We should learn something from it. Now, my point here would be, and it is something I'm myself still struggling with, because this is really the hard part, not only from a historical theoretical point of view, but also from a very concrete didactical point of view. How do you do this? And the idea would be, next slide, please. I think it might be useful to think not in terms of overly ambitious goals here. In peace education, there's sometimes a tendency to inflate the objectives a bit. I listed just a number of possible objectives educational professionals might aim for in concrete projects. For instance, critical thinking, multi-perspectivity, engaging students, critical sensitivity towards violence, dialogue on sensitive and controversial issues. These are all things that you can work on. Part of them are attitudes. You can call them peaceful or citizenship attitudes. The point here is that if you combine these, you might, if you succeed in engaging all these kinds of attitudes in concrete projects, you might be working on peaceful attitudes in students. But the point here is that while being ambitious, I think it's also useful to be somewhat modest here, and not all projects will address all these attitudes at the same time. And the message here is, from a didactical point of view, it's useful to always think about, if you do a concrete project, think about what exactly is your goal, what do you want to achieve with students, then what is your target audience, what is the group you are working with, and of course here the assumption, the maxim is always know your students, and then how do you want to do it. This all seems very self-evident when I say it like that, but it's actually in practice, it's oftentimes the most hardest part of setting up projects. Okay, I think I'll leave it at that for the moment, And the next slide is just a goodbye from me. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. van Allstein. So all of the questions about remembrance education that were first brought up in the first presentation by Professor Stola, such as the responsibility we have to the past, the intersections between commemoration and education, and the space that should exist for discussion in the middle. Dr. van Allstein brought us to the practical applications of some of these questions in the classroom. So starting with the idea of, the difference between history education and remembrance education is that remembrance education attempts to not only teach about the past, but to teach students to learn something about the past, to introduce the moral dimension of the violent past, and how teachers, by knowing their students, can really bring these ideas to the classroom, by knowing, for example, their students, and in the diverse classroom, the different degrees of emotion, for example, that can be given to different events, and thus making the lesson as effective as possible. Continuing our panel discussion with us now is going to be Jean-Philippe Restouet, who has worked for the Council of Europe since 1994 in both the youth and the education directorates. And the focus of his work has been the development of harmonization of higher education systems and their qualifications frameworks across Europe. So he is currently representing the Council of Europe within the European Qualifications Framework Lifelong Learning Advisory Group. He follows working groups of the Bologna process, the Lisbon Recognition Convention on Recognition of Qualifications, and the development of national qualifications frameworks within the higher education of the European higher education area. So coming quite close to like the very, very practical application of remembrance education in the classroom. He's here to speak to us today about the role of public authorities in remembrance education and how policy affects remembrance very directly. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Yes, good morning, and thanks for the invitation and for the welcoming. So just also to clarify, I'm a civil servant working for a European institution, including 47 member states, and on the Cultural Convention, even more, working with more than 50 members signatories of the Cultural Convention. So my question is really on what is the role on public authorities and on a European context, because this may also, I will say, a little bit spices the question, in the remembrance education. So I will try to share my, so hope that it works. So share my screen. Excuse me for the technical problem. Can you? Does it work? Hello?
Yes, we can see it.
You can see it. Okay, good. So the first thing is to make the things so to put where one of the difficulty of when we speak about remembrance. This is a photo in Elista, which is in Kalmuki. Kalmuki is one of the autonomous republic within the Russian Federation. It's in the north of the Caspian Sea. The Kalmuk people is the only Buddhist people in Europe, so it's a very specific group. And this group was all deported by Stalin in December 43, February 44. In 96, this monument was built. What is interesting in this monument is that, so it's a monument on exile and return. So here on the top of this little hill, you have a big statue, a little bit in the same spirit that the one we was presenting today regarding the Ghetto, the Warsaw Ghetto Prize. So it means if you will go there, you will see people in a train deported. But what is interesting me here is that, in fact, if you go directly from the down of the picture to this monument, it gives you the impression that it's very straight, that is very easy, that is a very short line. But in fact, to reach this place, you need to turn around quite a long time. And when I did it, it was really surprising because it takes something like more than half an hour to make this little work to go up. Why this? Because remembrance is never given. You need, if you want to remember, it's a work. It's a work also in a kind of analytic approach of the word work. And so when we speak about remembrance education, we need to be aware that is not a direct, oh, you can easily remember. No, to remember, you need really to make this long walk to go up. Just to conclude before I spend to the next, that the monument was built in 96 by, in fact, by a Russian sculptor who was himself in exile during the communist time in United States. So it was also interesting on this. So when we speak about remembrance education, what do we speak about? What does it mean? And I just, and it's the first line here, it's a kind of, not a joke, but you try to Google translation between two languages, French and English, about remembrance and history and memory. And you will see that remembrance is first translated in French, souvenir. Souvenir will be translated in English like memory, and memory will be translated in French like mémoire. So,
excuse me, I'm so sorry. We're just, we have a few questions in the audience, whether you could make the presentation full screen so it would be easier to see.
Okay, excuse me.
Thank you.
Like that?
Yes, that's much better. Thank you so much. Please continue.
No, I'm sorry. So the issue between remembrance, memoir, history, again, we need to be clear about what we speak, and clearly the intervention of Martin just before put an issue on this. When for public authority, when we speak about remembrance education, what is the difference with history education? And we need, both as citizen or as a public authority, a critical approach of all this term, keeping in mind that remembrance is a long and difficult process. And here the question is, for each public authority, whoever is responsible in a given state or territory of this responsibility, if it's a local or national level, and everything is possible in between, what we need to transmit as memory or as history? And why we have this question? Because to have a common past is a condition for living together. And here, clearly, this question is a heavy political one, because living together is how do we make politic, meaning the life of the city with the past of the city. And accepting that from Athens, we know that sometimes the city decided to forget a number of things to be able to live together. Also, you can have different ministries involved. So it's not only the Ministry of Education, it's the Ministry of Culture, it's the Ministry of Army, it's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which can deal with the issue of remembrance or history. And in some place, they really have their own interest in what to do with a monument, with a place. And during this 3 days, we refer very often to Ypres, obviously, even I will say in terms of the territory and who is responsible for different cemetery, you have different bodies who are interested in this specific place. And of course, a different tool, which means also that it is a question on pedagogy. And again, dealing with, do we work more on emotion or do we work more on the kind of rationality, what was mentioned by Martins, about the issue of history being more an academic and eventually remembrance perceived as a more moral, but also a more individual touch and consequences for the people. And this is a question that also the first intervention for Dariusz about Pauline, which is definitely a question that every time museum building, museography needs to answer. Do you more address to the emotion of the visitor or do you more address to a kind of rationality of the visitor? The worst case in my situation, in my experience, is for the one who knows the Schindler Museum in Krakow, who is really building on purely emotion, and I really have a lot of problem of this kind of approach where it's only believed on emotion. So for public authorities, the question is how to live with the richness and the pain of the past. And I already mentioned that in the old Athens, it was after the Civil War, a moment that the city decided, okay, we forget. And I want to mention also the Article 1 of the Edit de Nantes. So I put you the date. The Edit de Nantes was the end of the religious war in France. And the first article of this edit said that it would not be possible after the edit to speak about anything who took place during the wars, during the religion. So it was not possible for anyone after the edit, victim, perpetrator, bystander, if I took the Hilbert division, to mention what happened during the war. Why? Because in this moment, they believe that, okay, if we want to live together, we need to forget. Again, it did not work, but in one moment, that was the solution that the royal power decided in France in the 16th century to deal. Because the problem is difficult for any human community to face its past, and it's true from individual to state level. Because of course, nobody wants to be a bastard, neither individually, neither a state. And it's probably even more difficult for a state to recognize its responsibility when it was not fair. And this is really one part of the difficulty. How a public authority, a state, again, whatever level, acknowledge the unfair, the responsibility of the public authority in what happens. And just for the one who follow a little bit the French political situation on this question of remembrance and memory, just 2 days ago, the French president, Mr. Macron, publicly recognized that one Algerian militant was killed by the army. He was thrown out of the window, where till now the official statement from the army was that this guy was killed himself. And it's only more than 50 years after that the French presidency acknowledged that, yes, it was a crime, and this guy was pushed by the French army in the frame of the Algerian War. The idea here, if we go more on a philosophical approach, is really to deal with how history, memory, and forget can go together, and how can we build together our common heritage for our future. So the role of public authority, why? Because respecting the level of responsibility, and for instance, who is in charge of the history teaching from the classroom to the ministry. So the public authority fixes the general frame in which who is in charge of what, in terms of, for instance, history education, in terms of hours, in terms of level, qualification. Also in terms of giving access, and it was mentioned both the day before and yesterday about free research. So we need to give access to archive. And of course, the transmission of knowledge, and transmission of knowledge meaning that somewhere you have people who say that one narrative is preferably or promoted towards different narrative. And of course, it's a choice which needs to be questioned, especially if the narrative eliminates a number of victims group from this narrative. Typically, the issue of slavery, that for a number of people, the slavery history and the remembrance of the slavery is not enough present in a number of historical narrative and need to be reintroduced, including by questioning the monument who testified of, in one moment, some people who were esclavagists were promoted for different reasons. Again, in France, for instance, Colbert, because it was a great ministry of a great king, but it was on the same time the one who wrote the Black Code, the code who organized the slavery. So clearly, the responsibility of public authority is also regarding the curriculum development and the access of historical document and plays, including budgetary, to give support to a number of remembrance plays. And again, we know that it's not obligatory the first priority for the public authority to really give the financial means for this place to be able to transmit the remembrance on what happened in this place. And of course, for again, in a democratic perspective, and as I work from the Council of Europe, which is an organization promoting democracy, state of law, human rights, for us, it's based on these values. So how through education, history or remembrance education, how to promote a number of values like democracy, citizenship, no discrimination, and human rights. So in the presentation, it was not mentioned that I'm also in charge, and perhaps we can take here one of the questions that that you answered before. So here I will need Alicia to, can you show the result of the second question, please? Alicia? Hello? Hello, hello?
I can see the results of the question have been shared.
Okay, because I didn't saw, because that was my question. So I'm it's a little bit complicating because in this case I need to. Okay, so I will. Okay, so I will go without, because otherwise I need really to go out of my system to be able. So I will continue.
Would you like us to read out loud the answer?
Yes, that will help.
Okay, so the question was, in your national reality, do you think that for the transmission of the history and remembrance of the Holocaust, public authorities? And then there's 5 options, and do the right thing has about 15% of answers, can do more, as I would say 42% of answers, can do more is the answer with more votes. And then we have stay too much on, can you open the answer maybe? Stay too much on a commemoration and symbolic level is the second most voted with 28.57 answer. Do not really do anything has slightly less than 10% of the answer, and try to manipulate history to avoid facing the responsibility of the state during the Holocaust has 5%. So in order of preference, they are can do more, stay too much on a commemoration and symbolic levels, do the right thing, do not really do anything, and try to manipulate history.
Thanks a lot.
No problem.
So you can ask why to have a special attention on the Holocaust. Again, inner thinking project. The starting point was, and a number of partners and consortium are organizations specialized on Holocaust remembrance, but some other are more general one. But also for the Council of Europe, we have a special attention on the Holocaust. Why? The first one is because 75 years after the discovering or the opening of the Auschwitz Gate, we face nationalism, anti-Semitism, populism, and anti-Semitism action in a number of European countries is still one of a social and political problem. Secondly, because the Holocaust is an integrating part of the European anti-Semitism. And at the same time, it's a symbol of one of the worst that a human being can do to another human being. And here is the first, I will say, tension between the reality that people who were mostly and firstly the victim of the Holocaust were Jewish, but 75 years after, this symbolic approach is for all human beings. Also respecting that the Holocaust is definitely a worldwide phenomenon because it touched all over the world. And also it's a European crimes committed against Europeans by Europeans. And as a European institution, I say we have a kind of duty to face this and to reflect this. And of course, the industrial rationality used to creating deaths, which is quite unique. So it's not to say that there were no other genocide. So of course, the Rwanda or even what is going now in China with the Uyghur, you can also start to question. So there are really, but here is really to say that during the Holocaust, it was really an idea how we can creating death as quick as possible. And this is quite unique in human history. And also, but also immediately recognizing that the question of remembrance is not only relating to Holocaust, but is the general role of the history teaching. So we need both to contextualize any kind of mass crime, atrocity we are committing, at the same time respecting when we speak about the Holocaust, about what is specifically proper to the Holocaust. And why it's so important today, because as it was mentioned also by Dariusz, that we have today in Europe a number of government, of public authority, which consciently misuse history to keep the power and to, I will say, to comfort their electorate. And this, of course, is really a big issue and a big problem because it's very dangerous to play with the past or to try to play with the past. And it cannot be only an issue of never again, because in fact, several moments in our European history proves that this never again, it did not work. It did not work that in 1918, in every number of European countries and even on the world level, there were people, shadows, ghosts, as a painting on Ypres Warsaw, who said never again. Or you have the famous image of Abel Gance J'accuse, where you see on the screen all the soldiers going out of the tomb and said never again, except that less than 30 years after, we were starting again. So the never again, yes, we have a moral duty not to forget, but without illusion on what is really the possibilities that history can be a tragical tool. So we tried to make a recommendation on passing the remembrance of the Holocaust and prevention of crimes against humanity. So pointing that remembrance is a politically act. So it is, so when we say we need to remember, it is a political choice. And also that to say that today, to remember is a potential bulwark against racism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and all forms of intolerance. Also, to say that for this, we need all the time to keep a comparative approach, that we need also to take into account the diversity in the classroom, and so to know what is really the past of each of the learner, and to really also respect their, I will say, own heritage on this story about Holocaust, but also about other mass violence or other genocide or other crimes against humanity, if they were coming from some region we were, I will say, victims of this. But again, be aware of the mechanism can perhaps help us to more understand and to be able to warn us, be careful, here we're recreating potentially a number of self mechanisms. We can't creating the words. Again, underlying that we are not sure is a deal. We try to promote this, but knowing that the worst is never out of the landscape. Even with all the knowledge, it could be that we will repeat the same things. But again, for a public authority, we want to live to promote a living together in equal dignity, which was the title of the White Book of the Council of Europe on intercultural learning. In this case, to have a remembrance education is a try to have as much as possible a peaceful memory who allowed the different components of our society to not to deny what happened, not to deny the injustice, the unfair, but to try to find together, with all the difficult in heritage, a possible building together future. So for Europe, this of course is still a lot of challenge. The question of the multi-perspectivity, because it's not so easy to accept that, yes, what perhaps was a national hero in this national context is considered as really a bastard or a criminal in another context. So how can we accept this? In terms of the narrative, when the narrative are in contradiction to one to each other, again, what we deal with that? Do we accept that one narrative is more legitimate than another narrative? Fine, but again, how we deal with these different narratives. But also, I will say, really, for me, the respect for the victims, who they were in terms of image, and also nobody can forgive for the one who are not more here. So in this, to say, yes, we need to give back a name, we need to give back a place, as it was mentioned yesterday in the Ypres Museum, and so to give back the dignity of everyone who were victims of crimes against humanity, but keeping in mind, and again, for a public authority level, that yes, but there's some people who were on the ethic point of view, more acceptance than other. So this is not to say that the one who killed and the one who is killed need to be put in the same level. No, even if we can understand the mechanism we bring to the killing, at the end, we still need to have this ethic question, how to avoid that people in their mind, in a really make the choice to kill. So here, the responsibility of the politician is not to put salt on the injuries of the past. And unfortunately, this is not really the case in Europe today, where you have too many countries in which politicians, or by amnesia or by really distortion of the past, play the past to really keep the power in the given society. But also, all this need to be sound very humble, that also we need to accept that the unacceptable is part of our heritage. And to conclude, I want to finish with this image that probably all of you know. is the Stoppelsteine, so pierre d'achoppement, stumbling stone that you can find in a number of European cities from people who were so deported, killed in concentration and death camp, or just were in exile. So, and you find all this. And just I want to conclude here to say that perhaps remember education is just to avoid to stumble on our own memory, that we are still able to work together and to build together our future. And I will finish there. Thanks for your attention, and I try to close. Yes.
Thank you very much, Jean-Philippe Restiaux. What a fantastic quote, that we must accept that the unacceptable is a part of our heritage. I think this is a very common theme that we have seen throughout all of the presentations, and I welcome all of the audience members to think of questions during the break that we're about to go to, specifically about this topic, about the unacceptability of the past, the violence of the past, but how we can deal with it now today in our classrooms, to try to make sure that the never again is something that is not just words, but perhaps also actions. So thank you very much, Jean-Philippe, and also to our three speakers, to Professor Dariusz Stola, to Dr. Martin von Allstein, and of course Jean-Philippe Restiaux. We are going to go on a break now. We are a bit early, but we are going to go for, Isabelle, is it about a 10-minute break, 15? When are we getting back?
A 10 minutes break is fine for me, yes.
Okay, so we will see everyone back at 11:40. In this time, I encourage everyone to write your questions in the comments to the video or on the form that was shared earlier. And please, along with the question that you pose, to please say the name of the speaker that you would like to address, unless, of course, the question is meant for all speakers. Alicia and I will start the Q&A off with some questions of our own, and then we will quickly move to questions from the audience. Okay, so we will see everyone back, I suppose, at 11:42, just so it is actually 10 minutes. See you in 10 minutes. Hello, everyone, and welcome back from the break. I hope that everybody's had a chance to make some tea, make some coffee, get settled, and get comfortable for our Q&A session. All of our three speakers are here. You can pose your questions to them either individually, like I said, or to all at once, and then they will all answer. So leading our Q&A session is my colleague Alicia Modena. Alicia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you for leading the first part of this panel discussion. As Catherine anticipated before the break, we would like to kick off the Q&A with a question from us at EuroClio for all the three speakers. And we would like to ask this question because it connects quite well with the previous days of the conference, but also with the national trainings that we have been doing at RETHINK. So it's a rather long question because of, well, all its connections, but I'm gonna try and keep it as short as possible. And the question is, we have been talking a lot about how important it is to help students understand the relevance of remembrance education, the relevance of the topic at hand, and to be able to answer a question that, unfortunately, is sometimes asked by students, and that is, why should I care? These events happened so far in the past or so far from a geographical perspective. Why should I care? And so I was wondering if any of you had any advice for educational professionals on how to take on this question. I don't know who would like to start. That's always the tricky part with question for all speakers. Okay, Dariusz, Professor Stola, please feel free to start.
And to start answering. My answer when I hear such question is to stress that people of the past, including people who committed horrible crimes, were not very much different from us. I always say that, my personal experience of living in communist Poland is that many bright people were joining the Communist Party or the Communist Youth Movement, and this way became complicit in some nasty things. And most of young Germans were members of Nazi organizations. And in totalitarian regimes, there were massive parties having millions of people, and these people were not a priori at the beginning much different from us. Some of them gradually became criminals, for example, but it was a process. At the beginning, there was nothing that determined them becoming criminals. So this is the stress that even across the time distance or space distance, we share something with the people of the past that they are not very much different from us. And we can learn from their experience, including the worst experience, the experience of those who committed some evil. So it doesn't work always, but I think it's a viable argument.
Thank you very much. I am gonna keep it open. Who would like to go next? Okay, Martin.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question. Now, first of all, to start off, I don't think it's a question necessarily unique to remembrance education. I think all teachers know that this can be a question that is often raised in a classroom. So first point might be that teachers and educational professionals can rely on their basic didactical skills in bringing content to pupils. That being said, I think there are some points to be made for remembrance education or history teaching in particular. I can list a few. First of all, linking up to what Professor Stola already said, is like there's in history, I think, and in working with memory, a force of storytelling and working with the human side, the human dimensions and perspectives, and working with testimonies from multiple perspectives. Perpetrators, as was mentioned, victims, bystanders, and there's a number of perspectives that can be taken. That might be a way of bringing these histories, which indeed may be distant for some people, closer by. Another line might be, I was struck by the story of Wouter yesterday about the cab driver who went to a cemetery in West Flanders, might be an idea to go to sites. This is always something that is going on site is a technique to bring history closer by. Then thirdly, I think every history or every memory has many angles, and using these different angles can be a way of if you know your group, if you know the classroom, it can bring history closer by. And this also means if history has many angles, in some cases, for instance, in super diverse classrooms, it might be a very good idea to go beyond Eurocentrism, which sometimes it creates some distance. On the other hand, I think, and again, I'm referring to something that Dariusz said, some of these stories are dramatic in themselves. I think it's not always the best option to go for, like, let's say, an emotional inflation of the history. And then last point, I think I think there's room for more research on this point, actually. How do young people experience what we are talking about today? How do they experience going to sites? How do they experience learning about violent histories? So thank you.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Jean-Philippe, would you like also to address this question?
Yes. Again, as I mentioned, it's really an issue of why do we need to transmit, is also because how do we deal collectively with our past is a way, and it is one part of the reason how we can live together today. So it's really, and it's not to put away the contradiction, the difficulty, but no, it's to face it. This is our heritage in heritages. How do we deal with it? But we need to acknowledge them. Second element, why should I care? Because it's the history of any of us. Because any individual is relating to a here and now. And this is true also for our family. It's true for all the communities that we belong to. So why do I care? It's because this is partially my history. And I need to know it. Again, knowing that it is very difficult to accept what is unacceptable, and also to accept that there are so many complexity and dialogy that is difficult to live with all the contradiction of the past. Meaning that what Todorov said, Europe is at the same time the continent of the Athens of the 50s, of democracy, of building the city and the politics, really like this, and Auschwitz. It's both, Europe is both of these two things.
Thank you very much. So if I had to summarize some practical tips and tricks for educators, I would say, yeah, connect. What I understand from your answers is always connect with the humanity that's at the basis of the events, with the fact that these events were lived and perpetrated by human beings, and with the human dimension of the story. Well, thank you very much for answering this question. Thank you very much, Martin, for mentioning the fact that teachers can also reach out to their know-how, to their pedagogical knowledge, because I think it connects us quite well with the second question. The second question was asked from Joke van der Leurde on YouTube, and I believe it's for both Dariusz and Martin, judging from the timestamp of the question. And the question says, both speakers demonstrate that there is also a need for solid knowledge of educators addressing sensitive topics. How can they support teachers for this requirement? So I would leave it open for, well, first for Dariusz and Martin to reply, but then, of course, if Jean-Philippe, you also have something to say, we will be very, very happy to hear you. So I can't see Dariusz or Martin, so I'm just gonna call one of the two talking. Dariusz, please, let's go.
Thank you very much. You know, this is an important question, and I have seen it. The museum has a network of teachers, not only of history, of Polish, the civics, religion. In Polish schools you have religion teaching, mostly Catholic. So we have a networks of teachers all around the country, and the first thing we could give them is to bring them together, to realize that they are not alone in the interest, in the engagement. So networking, bringing people together to meet, share experiences, and all of them said that was very useful and also uplifting, because some people who are very much engaged do really great things, and especially when they touch sensitive topics. They may feel alienated in the local communities. They may not have many supporters. So this is the beginning. Second was providing with useful materials, educational materials, both printed and online. Third was the training. Some of them realize they have some needs to develop themselves, to know better. So also this is what we provided. And finally, running joint projects, which was a way of financing what they were doing. We also cooperate with non-governmental organizations that offer grants, for example, for education. And now under the present government, it's more difficult, but under the previous governments, they were sometimes quite willing to fund Holocaust-related education, on education related to the history of ethnic minorities in Poland, and we are very eager. We are very eager to cooperate. And finally, it's to bring to them other institutions. For example, local museums. You have small museums, town museum, regional museums, everywhere in Europe. And I was surprised, how many there are of them in Poland. And not in all of them, but in many of them, there are people who are really motivated and engaged, who want to make the museum relevant. And they are very eager to cooperate. They don't know that there is someone else who is a teacher, let's say in elementary school or in secondary school, in this town or the next town, with whom they can cooperate. So also bringing people together across institutions was useful. And finally, we did it in a very limited way, but there is an organization in Poland, the Forum for Dialogue, that does it extremely well. Was bringing the survivors or the families of survivors to these especially small localities. And there was a big event, very emotional, but very positive emotionally, for both people coming and meeting them. So this is something which may be also helpful. Thank you.
I see now, I was muted. Thank you very much for your answer, Professor Stola. Martin, would you also like to address the question? The question was, how can we support teachers to develop a solid knowledge to address sensitive topics?
Yeah, I think maybe I can make 2 points. The first one is that I think this is a good question. It's really important. I think on the one hand, it's important for teachers or schools or museums to train their staff in let's say a number of things. Dialogical skills is one. Also training in mediation, or how to manage conflicts when these conflicts manifest themselves in a group or during a visit or in classroom. I think based on our work, I think the main thread in how you go about doing that is the skill of posing open questions. That is really an important one, I think, while at the same time enhancing, and all words are important in this sentence, pedagogical techniques of guarding certain boundaries of what is acceptable to say in certain circumstances. I mean, if you go to a certain site, this sensitive, there are certain boundaries that are to be guarded during conversations. At the same time, open questioning is always, I think, one of the best techniques in doing this, in having a dialogue on sensitive issues or on controversial issues. That's the one point I wanted to make. The second one is from the standpoint of like a teacher or a school or a museum, how do you go about that? I think very important in that regard is that staffs and groups of teachers in schools have conversations, dialogues, even deliberations on what is sensitive and controversial, given a certain topic, or in a certain group, or in a certain classroom, or from the perspective of a museum, that you as a staff, with both the management, but also educational collaborators, but also very importantly, the guides, who are very often the face or the ambassador of the museum, that people talk together of what might be sensitive or controversial in our exposition or in this museum, and how can we prepare ourselves if certain situations pose themselves in terms of sensitive matters or controversy.
Okay, thank you very, very much also to you to answer to the question. Again, if I had to find some keywords from the answers, I would say, yeah, training and networking is what I heard the most. And I really, really liked also what Professor Stola said about connecting with the local heritage. This is something that, yeah, that we often don't really look into that much, but it's something that can definitely be of help in creating meaningful connections with history and even with sensitive topics. The next question, we're now entering into a couple of questions that are about specific parts of your presentation. And the first of this question is for Jean-Philippe. It came via an anonymous participant from France in the form. And the question says, regarding the difficulty for a state to acknowledge the past, we can also think of the Spanish government after Franco dictatorship. What can be the alternatives? Can the search for truth and forgiveness in Rwanda be an example? And I can imagine that, yeah, this participant wants to hear a little bit about your experience when it comes to Spanish government after the Franco dictatorship and what examples are out there about acknowledging difficult truths.
Definitely on a European perspective, this question can be multiplied by thousands of cases. And so I don't have any answer to this. I have just some elements of thought about it. First, the answer is definitely not the same immediately after the event and 50 years after. So which generation? If it's a generation who lived the event, who lived the tragedy, or if it's a generation of grandson, granddaughter. So the question is not exactly the same how to deal, because for some is how to deal with the inheritage, for some is how to deal with my own history. So that is one element we need to be clear. Second element is really between justice, truth, and peace. And of course, our living together is we are all the time moving between this all. Dariusz in his intervention really put the things, it is on the level of the truth. So the truth, we cannot build on lie. Okay. But again, we cannot live on lie. Does it mean also, and here on the political term, that the same conflict can be repeated for ages? Second hypothesis, to put away the conflict, so not to acknowledge that it is a disagreement, does not help. And to take the case of Spain after Franco, the pact of silence, 40 years later, we know that it doesn't work, because there are still a number of issues. And again, if I take the issue of grandfather, granddaughter, grandson, as you know, one part of the problem for a Spanish country in the different community in the Spanish country is to know from the mass grave during the Civil War. So you have still a number of family who does not know where the grandfather or grandmother is buried or were killed. So clearly a process in terms, again, of for our living together, the process of a true reconciliation, so meaning living with all this pain and very conflictual. Yes, there are mechanisms. It was mentioned the Rwanda. It mentioned also we can remember South Africa with True and Justice Commission. Again, it takes really a long process. And my last comment is to say that it's really a call for politicians and public authority. Don't play with the past. Don't put salt where you know where it is hurting. And unfortunately, in Europe today, we have too many politicians who put salt, knowing perfectly that it will hurt a number of the people in the society where they live.
Thank you very much for your answer and for being so clear about the various what are the possibilities that we have at hand when we need to acknowledge the past and how we can go about it. We have another couple of questions. I would like to invite participants to there's still time to send in your questions on YouTube or on Facebook or via the form. We have all of them open, and we'll try to answer as many questions as possible. The next question also came via the form. It's still from a participant from France, from Pierre in this case. And it's a question to Professor Stola. And it says, by giving too much importance to the word of the victims or their descendants and emotion taking more place within social network, is there not a risk of giving access to a falsified version of the story?
A very good question and a very sensitive one. Namely, we must have great respect for survivors of horrible crimes of the past, and especially since the Holocaust became such an important part of our culture, at least the culture of the West, Europe, United States, as a symbol of the radical evil. The survivors acquired a really incomparable prominence as the most important source of information about the past. But historians know that survivors also make mistakes in their stories. And this is not unusual, that they confuse some dates, events. So the living memory of an eyewitness is important, but it cannot be the one and only source of information on a topic. The question is what to do when you are facing a situation, when you see a survivor saying something which is obviously untrue, factually incorrect, or offers a wrong judgment. And that requires a lot of really delicate approach to the topic, but this is not impossible. And I would even say that stressing the truth and stressing the methods of verification, maybe because I'm academic historian, so I believe in procedures of verifying information, is a kind of protecting mechanism against misinformation, which may be bona fide, out of the goodwill. It may be also uplifting. And still, we should protect ourselves against any kind of distortion, even a distortion that is unwillingly coming from a survivor.
Thank you very much for your answer. Yeah, the person that asked the question mentioned after the question, they mentioned that you reminded the importance of research, and having multiple sources and researching, as far as I can understand also from your answer now, are quite key, especially when dealing with testimonies or with highly sensitive events. Okay,
I can give you a beautiful example. Just recently, it was a week ago, that one of my colleagues, actually two of my colleagues, historians of the Holocaust, had a lawsuit, had a legal challenge raised by a woman, a person who claimed that they misrepresented her uncle as someone who collaborated with the Germans in hunting the Jews in the forest during the war. And that was really a very complicated story, because the same survivor, a Jewish woman who survived the war partially in this village, at different moments in her life gave conflicting testimonies about this man. At one point, she claimed, yes, he saved me, he helped me survive, he offered me false identity. At another moment, he said, yes, he helped me, but at the other time, he contributed to the discovery of a group of Jews in the forest. So you have really very sensitive story, and someone being emotionally involved with her uncle about it. But for historians, this is not unusual that we have conflicting evidence, or that we have evidence that we cannot fully trust. And then we should say words like probably, likely, or it's not impossible. There are facts that we cannot establish 100% for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And also during your presentation at the very beginning, you mentioned that for every historical event, there is a whole series of evidence, and it's with the historian to decide, to establish which kind of evidence is going to be used in the reconstruction of the event. And that is also what happens with testimonies. Especially, when we deal with highly emotional topics, and when giving the testimony is partly also relieving the trauma for who is going to share. Thank you very, very much for tackling this question. It is a rather sensitive question. The last question so far comes via YouTube from Jonathan Evans-Zohar. Jonathan is involved in a project that is led by us at EuroClio that's called Football Mixed History. And he says that we see football communities, especially fan groups, do many remembrance activity. And he is asking, does formal education use such non-formal remembrance enough? And I would like to start once again with Dariusz, because I believe that, starting from the connection between museums as places of non-formal education and their connection with schools, and whether or not the activities of the museums are brought to schools, is a good place to start to answer this question.
Well, so it depends on the teacher. As always, you can have the best programs in education. You have lavishly funded schools and great museums, but when you have a teacher who is not interested or is not prepared, doesn't have the proper skills or personal motivation to do things, it will never work. I was lucky to meet hundreds of really great teachers, and they love to use the museum. First, somehow students prefer to learn outside of the school building than inside the school building. Maybe that's a problem with our educational systems, but clearly going out brings more effects. The problem is that not everyone lives in the vicinity of a great museum. So then is the question of helping teachers locate. Teaching history in a site-specific, in a place where it happened, has a power of itself. It's like the power of the authenticity of original objects in the museums. This particular psychological reactions that we have when we face an original object from the past, when you see things up close. It works with emotions too. And the same effect we can have just going to a place where something happened. It doesn't have to be a great event. And then people realize that history may be distant in time, but it's not distant in space. That maybe around the corner, maybe in our town or in our village, something happened, and then it really works. Our museum, we've got even an award for it. was extremely active in reaching out to the teachers, because we really recognize that teachers are most important. So hence we had this program of networking, meeting them. Actually, we established a group of teachers who were our consultants when we are designing a new temporary exhibition or some educational materials. We were asking our friends, teachers, to share their opinions about it, because you may have a perfect, let's say, booklet or a video on some event, which is perfect from an academic historian, it's very accurate, but the teacher would immediately say, no, it will not work with 12 years old. So these are the practicalities and moments when we can help each other really both ways. It's not a one-way process that you have a bigger cultural institution which helps a single teacher. No, it's quite often works also the other way around.
Thank you very much. And Martin, you mentioned in a previous answer going outside of the classroom. So could you also share a little bit, from your experience, does this happen often enough? Do we use non-formal remembrance education practices and the experience of memorial institutes enough in the classroom as well?
It's a bit difficult to answer that question empirically, because I don't really have the data to say we use it enough or we don't use it enough. I can talk as Dariusz already did, to the many opportunities in doing it, in linking formal and non-formal remembrance activities. Going on site is really important. In my perception, in my view, a lot of schools in Belgium and Flanders go to these sites. They go to Ypres, visit the memorial sites of the First World War. They go to Mechelen and Breendonk, where the Kazerne Dossin. So there is really a dynamic going on in doing that, where you link up formal and non-formal. But so I think that I completely agree with Dariusz on that point. I would just add this point that there are, and that was in the question as well, there's also maybe, if you have formal and then non-formal, the museums, there's also another dimension. And in Antwerp, over the last years, there was a dynamic that speaks to this issue. A couple of years ago, a writer here from the city of Antwerp wrote a book on police officers during the Second World War, and namely on the topic of the deportation of the Jewish communities. And this book really began to lead a life of its own in these neighborhoods where, during the war, many Jewish people lived. Many people read these books. Oftentimes, they lived in the houses from where people were deported, and there was really this grassroots dynamic of starting to commemorate this. Every year, groups of people meet in these neighborhoods. They develop their own commemorative rituals. And this has gone back actually into the schools in these neighborhoods, because teachers and pupils in these schools started to realize what happened during the war, that there were pupils from their schools who were deported. And so there was this very interesting and very valuable dynamic, where you saw that formal education and these non-formal, really grassroots dynamics, very local, met each other. I think there is a lot of opportunities there as well. You can't really engineer that really happened locally, but it all begins with, I think, awareness and history telling about these very local histories and memories.
Yeah, it sounds like a very interesting initiative. I would be very interested in getting to know a little bit more about that. There's going to be some Googling happening after this panel discussion. And again, last but not least, Jean-Philippe, do you know of, from the point of view of public authorities, but also from your many years of experience, have you seen a tendency in using non-formal remembrance also in formal settings, or vice versa? Have you seen communication between these two sectors when it comes to remembrance education?
There are different ways to answer to your question, but in fact, I will answer to the role that non-formal education can play in terms of remembrance education. And I won't strongly support And again, I say non-formal education organization, like the one who put the question through the project from EuroClio, Football Make History. Because non-formal education which in theory the formal education should also put the learner in the center of the process. So I will say for an organization, especially I'm coming originally from the youth sector and from the youth organization. The youth organization is a place where a young person is in the center of why the organization exists. So meaning taking into account all the dimension of the learner. In this case, to deal with all the dimension, including the problematic path, the living condition of the learner, the inheritage of her own memory, I will say it's much more, in a certain way, easier in a non-formal setting than in a classroom. Not because the professor doesn't want to do it. Sometimes I don't know how to do it. Sometimes I don't have the time to do it. And so the global frame does not really allow to have this kind of experience. So I will stress the importance that non-formal education setting in a non-formal and especially through organization is really a place where it is already a lot of initiative working on remembrance. Secondly, definitely there are a lot, and this is not only in the field of remembrance, it's in the field of education, the passerelle between non-formal education and formal education are really multiplied and really a lot of them. Again, I will say when these passerelle are used, it must be clear from both sides what to expect from this passerelle. And not that suddenly the formal education say, oh, we don't know how to do it, asking or the memorial site or a non-formal education organization, please, can you do it yourself? So I will say it needs to be a dialogue when there are this non-formal education setting between all the different partners involved to be clear what they want to reach through this dialogue. Concretely, it means that when you have a group visiting a place, that the professor and the guide have a discussion before to what is the expectation from the formal education system for the professor towards this group, what this group would like to know, who they are, and to pass this information to the guide, that the guide is able to work with this specific group. So for me, it needs to be clear from all what can be expected from the different partners. And last but not the least, aiming that in terms of learning outcome, which is what in theory it's important in any lifelong learning perspective from a learner perspective, we all learn in different settings. And definitely the visit to a memorial space, to a museum, is a place where I will learn. But here I will put another issue that we did not put yet in the discussion, is the issue of the assessment of the learning. So how can we, both whatever responsibility we have, public authority, museum, a memorial site, professor, how do we assess the learning process in terms of remembrance education?
Thank you very much. Yeah, assessment is definitely an important part of the picture. I'm glad you mentioned it. We at EuroClio have been talking about assessment quite a lot, especially about assessing whether the learning of social and civic competencies, the internalization of concepts of remembrance education, and so on have happened. I've introduced the teacher's guide yesterday. Maybe I can just very, very briefly say that in the teacher's guide, we have a part about assessment, which might be interesting. And also that, the teacher's guide was created by connecting formal and non-formal education. So that might also be a good place to get some practical tips and tricks to go to your non-formal education institution that connects with your local heritage, and to start creating projects with them if you are a teacher, for example. There's a new question that came in on the the comments via YouTube from Joke van der Leeuwerorde. It's a very interesting question, and I think, yeah, it connects quite well with the concept of remembrance education as something that goes beyond remembering the First World War, Second World War, and the Holocaust. And Joke says, you mentioned all the commemorative places related to World War I and World War II, all very much related to the more obvious choices in national remembrance. But what about colonialism? More difficult to address. I believe this is also a question for all speakers. Maybe this time I would like to ask Martin to start, since you spoke a lot about memory and the various kinds of memory and about super diverse groups of students. Maybe you can start with, yeah, what about colonialism?
Yes, thank you for that question. I agree with the bottom line, and that's why I also included it in my PowerPoint presentation. I think first of all, I think it's also very important to talk about a number of histories and memories, and colonial histories is a very important one in that respect. But maybe from a theoretical perspective, it's interesting to ask the question: what exactly is what is the memory we want to teach about in remembrance education? And it might be interesting. I was struggling with that question because I come from an academic background, an academic historian, and then the issue of bringing memories into the classroom was not so easy for me. I struggled with that, and I came up with this thought, which is still under reflection and critical construction in my own head, of somehow, and this is also links up to the moral dimensions of remembrance education. The memories we want to work on somehow is still what you can call active history in historical consciousness. And what do I mean by active? It can be still politically active, it can be active from a hegemonical point of view, but it can also become active from a counter-hegemonical point of view. And I think that is what's happening with a lot of the activisms around the colonial heritage. That is that these statues are contested from a counter-hegemonical perspective. And this is interesting because then in the broader historical consciousness of society, some groups activate certain memories that perhaps were not so present in the memory landscape of that specific society at a given point in time. And what I'm trying to say is that all these kinds of memories that are somehow active or activated, I think, are very interesting to work on in remembrance education, because this is what I think multi-perspectivity might also mean in terms of remembrance education, that you also work on these kinds of memories. And so First World War and Second World War, for me, remain very important, but there are a number of other histories to be told as well. And if I can conclude by just referring to a project, I think, but also EuroClio is involved in talking to, for instance, people in Antwerp again about how they experienced the end of the Cold War, 1989. Here, there's a lot of Polish and people living in, for instance, in Antwerp, and it's interesting to talk about their memories, their histories. So I think I'm all for broadening the scope.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to ask, the same question to Jean-Philippe. So the question was, what about colonialism that is more difficult to address? Did you see, I don't know, a change in tendency, or what about colonialism from a point of view of public authorities and remembrance education?
Again, I would say more from a European perspective, how to deal with the question. Dariusz, in his intervention, mentioned the issue of the importance of the capacity to build counter-narrative. One of the difficulties that we have on European level, and again, when I speak European level, for me, working for an organization from Reykjavik to Vladivostok, so it's whole Europe, so it's really the big one, not speaking about the EU. Is it possible to have a common narrative? and including by the fact, a common narrative, able to read the unacceptable on the European history. And definitely colonialism is one of the, at least, problematic or unacceptable approach that Europe has with the rest of the world. Again, each country, part of Europe, has its own approach and his own, I would say, past to be able to deal with. Except that this past in a number of societies still play a role in the living together today, because it's not this living memory, which was just mentioned now, are not yet a peaceful memory, are still memory of conflict, of pain, and there are no reconciliation yet. So the question is that, yes, it should be all darkness, all dark side of the European history need to be faced, because otherwise we know that to try to put the dust under the carpet, it doesn't work, because we will have ghosts after, and we will have ghosts and ghosts are, one of the signs of the ghost is that can be very easily manipulated and using to make people afraid, to make people angry, etc. So it doesn't work. But also, honestly, we need to humbly recognize that we don't have an answer on how to deal with all. I mentioned, and I will conclude there, but we need to acknowledge as public authority, as state, what happened, including what one happened is against the values that we try to promote. And we know that, for instance, about colonialism, we are not yet in the way that we are able to face this. Or another thing that collectively we are not able to face is all the issue regarding the crimes of, again, putting between brackets, Stalinism, communism, whatever you want to call it, but the crimes relating on this ideology in Europe during the 20th century. And we are not yet collectively able to face it, because in some part of Europe, communism was a dream, where in another part of Europe, communism was a nightmare. And again, it's when I say this, I just make a photo of a reality. So yes, it is difficult to address, but at least like a seminar, like a RETHINK and project, etc., I would say we need to try, and more people convinced by sharing community of practitioners, better we will have chance to find some little solution.
Thank you very much for answering this question. I am going to come to you, Dariusz, in a second, but there's an additional question that came via YouTube still from Simon, and is connected to Yoko's question. And since we are now running out of time, because there's still a couple of presentations that are set to happen, I would like to connect the two questions so that you will have the possibility to, if you want, answer to both of them at the same time. So the first question is still from Yoke, is still, what about colonialism? And the second question is from Simon, and it says, well, related to Yoko's question, is the field of remembrance education permeated by Eurocentrism? Do forms of remembrance education exist in other parts of the world? So Dariusz, you have the floor, both what about colonialism and more in general, is there any other form of remembrance education outside of Europe?
So first about colonialism, I'm very glad that you have just heard this very insightful comments about the diversity of the past across Europe, the European Union and the wider Europe. Because the question of the colonial past and tackling colonialism as a topic of history differs very much, especially between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. Namely, while in Western Europe, most of the nations had some colonies in Africa and Asia and elsewhere. In Eastern Europe, yes, there was a Russian Empire, there was the Ottoman Turkish Empire, and the Nazi German Empire was clearly a case of bringing to Europe the racist technologies of total domination we know as the source of the genocide, but there were nations like Poland or Ukraine or Slovakia or Romania that never had colonies. So I also had this topic with my students that there is discrepancy. We have our own dark pages in history textbooks, but these are not pages about colonialism. On the other hand, there was clearly even those nations that did not have colonies overseas, Poles and Slovaks and Hungarians were quite eager to share a racist prejudice against Africans and Asians. So you don't need to have a colonial past to have a past of racial prejudice, and sometimes still present in culture. So this is something that we share, and I think this comparison with the communist past is interesting, because Western Europe does not have the experience of the communist rule like Eastern Europe has. And East Europeans for a long time have tried to explain to people in other member states of the European Union, for example, that this is our shared European past. And that was this anti-totalitarian argument that we should take into account both the crimes of Nazi Germany and fascist states and the crimes committed by the communist dictatorships. So I think we may compare it to the story of the colonial past of some nations, including very brutal colonial past, very abusive colonial past, and past without experience of colonial domination, but still some imports that we share across Europe. And speaking about the commemoration, well, this is something very human, and it's sometimes very difficult to distinguish between forms of religion going back to the really ancient times, to the origins of human beings, and commemoration as we have it at present. It's a feature in history is the secularization of some commemorative practices that in the past had a very strong religious aspect or religious meaning. So it's universal, it's global. There are different forms. You may have different ways of commemorating. For example, non-material stories about the ancestors, which are not only building identity, but conveying wisdom to new generations. I would rather speak about the diversity of the cultural forms of remembrance. This is what can distinguish certain civilizations or local cultures from others. But as a phenomenon, this is universal.
Thank you very much. We are almost out of time, but I would like to open the question to Martin and to Jean-Philippe anyway. So is Remembrance Education Eurocentric? I'm going to make it hard, and I'm going to ask you if you can to answer within 1 minute, starting from Martin.
The very short answer is I don't really know whether it's too Eurocentric. I'm going to answer the question in another way. I think the question opens up the possibility for teachers and educational professionals to start working on from that perspective, not necessarily from bringing in, for instance, the history of the First World, but starting from the question, what is remembrance? What is commemoration for you? And if you have a diverse group in your class or in your museum, that opens up a whole lot of perspectives, and based on that you can start working.
Okay, thank you very, very much. And Jean-Philippe, what do you think? Is Remembrance Education Eurocentric?
Two elements. In UNESCO, there also work on remembrance, on the remembrance of the Holocaust, but also on different place of remembrance. So, and it exists an NGO, an organization who deal with place on the of peace and reconciliation. So it's a network on different, and it's a worldwide network. It's not only European. second element, clearly from the Holocaust perspective, as I mentioned, the Holocaust was as really a worldwide consequences, accepting that it was a crimes committed in Europe by European against European. But third, and I believe that when we put this question of Eurocentrism is really also how to deal with the responsibility of Europe towards the rest of the world. And here I will say it's an issue of how can Europe, again, on a mezzo voce approach, not to say this is the truth, but at least Europe need to put in the package of the humanity is part of history and remembrance. And again, to contribute to this, because we cannot deny that Europe has a role in world history. But again, knowing that a number of concepts are European concepts and were imposed or were used by. So here it's all these questions which are not easy. And I guess the issue of remembrance, and again, I'm working in a European institution. So for me, clearly, it is in the European countries that I'm working in this question. Does it mean that it's too European centrist? I don't know, but it's how to deal with the European heritage with all the glorious and terrible page, and to share this with the rest of the world. But again, here the important word is to share, not to impose.
Thank you very much for these last few words. To share and not to impose is also another very interesting sentence and very nice takeaway from this set of presentations and panel discussion. So I would like to thank the three of you for joining us today and for joining us at our panel discussion, and to thank Catherine for the first part of moderation of this discussion. We are not finished yet with the session. I would like to give the floor to Isabelle, who is going to introduce our policy recommendations.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you also from my side to all the speakers and the moderation efforts that EuroClio did during this panel. Yes, we still have one deliverable that we didn't share with you, and that is that are the policy recommendations that we wrote for this project. Let me see. These policy recommendations, with these policy recommendations, we aim to support and help teachers, educators in their education efforts to enhance media literacy and critical thinking skills of their students in close collaboration with other partners, such as museums and memorials. And we also like to help them to overcome the challenge of dealing with controversial issues in their classroom. The table of contents of our policy recommendations, you can see them here. And I would like to share a few ideas on what you can expect in certain chapters.
Isa, I'm sorry to interrupt. We still see only slide 4 of your presentation.
Okay. I will try again. And now?
Let me see. Okay, yes, table of content.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for mentioning it. We have a chapter on remembrance education. As in RETHINK, we examined programs and tools that employ a historical perspective to address contemporary issues. And in this chapter, we give recommendation to get this part into school curriculums in order to provide pupils and students in a sustainable understanding of the mechanisms of genocides and crimes against humanity. And in this part, as in all the chapters, we link it to the other deliverables of our project to show how it can be facilitated. The Remembrance Education practices, there we used, of course, our collection of practices that you can find in our database and the experiences we had in the piloting activities described in the teacher's guide. And we used those experiences in order to respond to different needs across contexts and countries between different individual teachers or facilitators. And also here we drafted some recommendations that can help to develop a good practice in your own country or in your own institution or school. The third or the fourth chapter of the policy recommendation is on media literacy. And we made suggestions on how to increase media literacy skills of teachers and educators, but also for students. And again, our suggestions are linked to different good practices that you can find in the database, but also to modules of our e-learning platform. And we link them to show our readers an immediately practical and usable way of working on those topics. The teacher training through e-learning, through an e-learning platform. What we did in the RETHINK project is, in order to create this e-learning platform, we used a need analysis among teachers in Europe. And yesterday, Alicia explained how we did that. And this enabled us to address their needs in the best possible way in developing our modules. And the recommendations that we have written in this chapter are based on their needs. And we want to, teachers in Remembrance Education, we can strengthen their resilience and help them passing their message to their students. You can also find a chapter on the implementation of what we have developed in the RETHINK project and how we see the future. And in that part, we of course refer to our network, and we hope that in the near future, we will hear a lot about the members of the network. The policy recommendations, of course, you can find them on our website. They are downloadable, and only now there is an English version, but soon it will also be available in Italian, in German, in Polish, in Dutch, and in French, and you will be able to download them also on our website. I don't know if there are any questions already on the policy recommendation, but I would suggest that you just go through the brochure on the recommendations, and if you would have any questions even after the seminar, that you can send them to us, and we'll be glad to answer. We'll be glad to answer your questions then. I will check if any questions are coming through, but for the moment, I don't see anything popping up. That gives us some time to give the floor to our project coordinator, Clément Bardou, to address our audience for the last time. The floor is yours, Clément.
Thank you very much, Isabelle, and thank you for this great morning. Thank you, EuroClio, for moderating the panel, and of course, Dariusz, Martin, and Jean-Philippe for these great exchanges and discussions. So we are coming to the end of this final conference. of these 3 sessions of the final seminar. We've had the opportunity to address many aspects of remembrance education with really meaningful interventions from the speakers. To select and to remember some of them, we've seen with Nena Moknik the link between historical education and remembrance education, and the importance of bringing remembrance education into the classrooms. We've heard yesterday on the second session a museum point of view with the Wouter Sinev and the remembrance of the First World War in Flanders. Also, Professor Dariusz Stola reminded the importance of research to fight the distortion of history and the denial. And then today, this morning, Martin van Allstein also highlighted from scientific researches the different forms of memory that were really interesting to hear, and how these differences appear in practice. And finally, Jean-Philippe Restuex also gave us several clues about the role of public authorities and the difficulties they can face dealing with their own histories and memories. And we are really glad to see this diversity of point of views during these 3 sessions, and all these aspects addressed, and aspects that were also addressed by the RETHINK project during the 3 years of the project. All along the final seminar, you've had the opportunity to discover the work done during the RETHINK project. And we hope that this work and the results will benefit as many people as possible. So for teachers, educators, and organizations willing to use the practices, you can find online database of practices, handbook for teachers, and the e-learning platform on the RETHINK website. Of course, you can find also, as Isa said, the policy recommendations. We will share them with also national European authorities and also at a local level. If you want to cooperate and work with the RETHINK partners, you know that we've launched the RETHINK network on the first session. So you can join the RETHINK network by finding the statutes on RETHINK website and writing us an email, a message to join the network. We will be glad to hear your contributions and initiatives within Remembrance Education. So please feel free to join us with the network, or you can also contact any of the partner of the project on the RETHINK website. You can find all the contacts. Finally, of course, I would like to thank the persons and the organizations involved in the organization of the event, especially Isabelle Diependaele from Kazerne Dossin, and all the team from EuroClio, from Cesier, I wanted to say, and especially the backstage team that you didn't see on the screen, but had many work. Also, I would like to thank you for following this event, and I hope you appreciated all the presentations. And please feel free to share the videos on YouTube and Facebook. They will be available still some months and years, so don't hesitate to share them with your colleagues and friends. Last word, you can find the link on the comments and on the chat to complete the feedback forms. I don't know if there will be a QR code. Yes, you can find the QR code on the screen. With your smartphone, you can scan it and complete the feedback forms. This will help us to organize next online events, since it seems to be the new solution for this kind of projects. That's it for my side. Thank you all for all the speakers and all of your contributions. And please feel free to contact the RETHINK project if you have any questions, any contributions you would like to share. Thank you. Have a great day and stay safe. Bye-bye.